Well, good evening and welcome to ACT TV. It's been a very sad day in New Zealand with another terrorist attack on several citizens in a supermarket, the Newland Countdown. Clearly, there'll be a huge number of questions that people want to ask. We start by giving our sympathy to those who were innocent victims of this attack. We give our admiration and congratulations to the New Zealand Police Force, who were on the scene doing their job and reacted very rapidly to get the situation under control and prevent it from becoming potentially a much worse tragedy. We also like to congratulate and offer our admiration for those New Zealanders who did the Kiwi thing, stepping in to help the victims without hesitation. Good on those people. This kind of ideologically motivated violence has no place in New Zealand. The ACT Party stands for universal humanity, the inherent freedom and dignity of every single individual. Most of the time, we're standing up against that in the domestic New Zealand political context. But this ISIS-inspired attacker is the absolute extreme and diametric opposite of our values, that each person is a thinking and valuing individual, and nobody should ever be subjugated by violence to somebody else's will, particularly a will as crazy as ISIS purports. Of course, there's going to be questions about how was a person who was a foreign national in New Zealand for a decade and under surveillance for 5 years from 2016 to now, and still out there in the community. Why was it that the best the police could do is have a series of officers following him around at all times to check on his every movement? Why couldn't he be in jail? Why couldn't he be deported? I think part of the answer to that is in the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the Christchurch terror attacks, which found that there was no offence for planning a terror attack. That's why he couldn't be put in prison. It may also be why he was unable to be deported. There was that legislation passed through its first reading in Parliament in May. ACT supported it, and our Justice spokesperson, Nicole McKee, has been watching carefully at that legislation as it's passed through the Select Committee process. It's due to be reported back in November, and we'll certainly be taking a very keen interest in that piece of legislation in light of this latest this latest event. We should be able to put people in prison if they are clearly planning a terrorist attack, as it appears this guy was. When it comes to him being in New Zealand, it's not clear at this point what his legal status was. The Prime Minister looks decidedly ruffled when she was asked why he couldn't be deported, saying that there were some complications in this particular case. Over the next few days, we'll be expecting her to tell us what those were and why it was that the person could not be deported from New Zealand, given that he'd been in prison already once. But what I would say is that there'll be a lot of people who want rapid action. Lock them up and send them out will be the call from some people. It's a good time to reflect on our values. After a previous heinous terror attack, ACT alone stood for due process, the rule of law, and not going after people or perhaps rushing the due process of the law in order to achieve a political end. It will be critical that we apply these principles again, that lawmaking is sober and careful, and that we don't rush to an outcome that is substandard because the political process panics or people want to get a result rapidly. We've had enough experience of that kind of lawmaking. Tonight, we're planning to bring on Brooke van Velden, ACT's Deputy Leader, our health spokesperson, our housing spokesperson, somebody who has been a rising star in New Zealand politics for over a year now since she took the national stage. Brooke is, as far as I'm aware, New Zealand Parliament's only economist. She's somebody who played an instrumental role as a backroom operator in getting the End of Life Choice Act passed, to the extent that after I passed that legislation, the media started writing features about her. It's a real pleasure, Brooke, to have you along tonight. And let's just start by talking about what's happened today. We were going to be talking about mental health and what people may be feeling in light of the event. Particularly, there are a lot of people, not as many people as normal because of level 4, but people who may have been involved in this incident if they were in the supermarket, or they may know people who were related.
Yeah, well, hi, David. I have to admit, I wish I was joining you with a bit of a lighter heart tonight, but I think it's really hard for any of us not to take what's happened today personally and feel the effects of that. And I think, for people living in Auckland at the moment, this is, part of a triple whammy. We've had the lockdowns, but secondly, we've had the floods this week, and now a terrorist attack. And if people are feeling anxious, I mean, I really do hope that you reach out for the support that you need, because that is a lot to process and deal with in 1 week. But I feel slightly better knowing that there are some support out there for people who may have actually witnessed that attack in person. And just this week, I was really lucky to be in a meeting with Victim Support. And that's an organization that helps people who have seen terrible accidents, people who have witnessed crimes, and they help them with that trauma and help them go through court processes, but a whole range of different scenarios, from people witnessing car crashes, for example. And I'm just very grateful to know that there is an organization out there that is going to be able and willing to help these people as they come to terms with what they've actually seen.
Yeah, I actually have a relative who has recently started volunteering for Victim Support. It is a tremendous service that helps a lot of people, mainly volunteers, and it's that Kiwis helping Kiwis. So many people think the solution to any problem is to tax people and then pay someone else to do it. Often people taking their own initiative are of more help to citizens. And it's one of the things that we saw today with some of those brave people that came to the aid of people who'd been attacked without any hesitation. So tell us a bit more. What sort of service did the Victim Support do? People get in touch. What happens next?
Yeah, so they do a range of services, and they help people who need somebody to help listen to them, help process their thoughts, mainly go through the court process. So anybody from a victim of a sexual assault, all the way through to, we heard examples of people whose children had actually been murdered, and help them write the impact statements for being in court. But also if somebody has witnessed something and they might be needing to come into court as a witness, they help them through that process and sit down with them and guide them through it. Because most importantly, at any time of trauma, it's important that there's somebody who is listening, who tells you that your feelings are valid, and also knows what the process has been like for people that they've helped before. Because being in these situations for the first time can cause a huge amount of anxiety and distress. But knowing that there is a person there who does this often and knows what these feelings will be like is a huge amount of comfort to people.
Yeah, hey, so, and just people may be interested, this is something that as a caucus act, we decided that we really wanted to be a learning caucus. One of our jobs as ACT MPs is to keep learning and to increase our knowledge about policy. So every Tuesday when the House is sitting, after our caucus meeting that most parties do on Tuesday morning, we actually have a lunch where we bring in somebody from somewhere in society just to learn a bit about what they're doing, so that we're in touch with what's going on, and rather not be the week that it was helpful to have heard from Victim Support, but that was this week's special guest, and we were really impressed with what they had to say. So just to sort of think a bit more about mental health, this will obviously put a lot of fear and anxiety in a lot of people who were there, but it's not the only source of mental health and strain that particularly younger New Zealanders are facing. There'll certainly be a lot of people at present who have huge anxiety caused by the uncertainty of a lockdown of an indeterminate length. Talk us through a little bit about your work in the mental health portfolio and where ACT comes from on that.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, David. And these lockdowns have come at a huge amount of mental distress to young people. There was a survey done at the end of the last lockdown that actually showed nearly 50% of people from the ages of 18 to 24 went through moderate to severe anxiety. That's huge. And we're going to see ramifications of these lockdowns for years, because one of the things that's so important to children of any age is a form of stability and certainty. And having that taken away, with school routines taken out, university studies taken away, losing a little bit of motivation to even get up in the morning and losing social interaction as well and face-to-face conversations has had a huge impact. And I don't think we're truly going to see the effects of that for a really long time. But one of the privileges of the portfolio that I hold is a lot of people reach out to me and they tell me their personal stories. And a few months ago now, a man reached out to me and said that he himself had committed suicide, or tried to, many, many times. And he kept getting referred back to the same service provider that his DHB was telling him to go to. But he said he didn't want to, because that one had done absolutely nothing for his mental health. But there wasn't another service provider that was available. And that's what I'm hearing a lot. Doesn't matter where you are in the country, there's just a lack of service provision for people who genuinely need help. But also, it's not just that the services aren't available, it's that the ones that are there don't often meet the needs of the people who are accessing them.
So just to be clear, the New Zealand taxpayer puts up about $2 billion a year. That's about $400 a citizen, which doesn't sound like much, but majority of people at any given time aren't using it. So it's actually thousands of dollars, if not tens of thousands of dollars, available for people in great need. And we just aren't getting the level of service in many instances. So what do you do to fix that?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, we just have to do better. But the way of looking at it is that the whole system seems to be broken. There is far too much bureaucracy. We're not putting people at the center of their own healthcare needs. And people are telling us it's far too complicated to try and access the services that they should be able to access. So with the $2 billion that's allocated for mental health care every year in New Zealand, it's quite a hodgepodge system. You get allocated money through either the Ministry of Health or through your local DHB. But every local DHB has different service contracts, and most of them contract themselves. So they're getting taxpayer money and they're also providing their service. So there's a bias in the system where they're wanting to fund themselves. And I'm hearing from so many NGOs that are saying, I really think that I have something that works. I just cannot access the money to get that up and running.
So it's a closed shop where the DHBs are basically self-serving. There's no competitive tension there. There's no incentive to innovate. There's no competition. So then when someone like Mike King comes along with the Gumboot Friday idea, he points out, look, I could do this so much cheaper, so much better. Where's the inlet for him? Why is it so hard for someone with a service like that? I mean, the only reason he eventually got funded is that he's actually good in the media. He's a former comedian, a major personality, and he was basically able to pressure publicly the Prime Minister to give him some money. Most people that are good at treating mental health don't have any of those tools. So how do you actually give new and innovative services a shot at competing for that pool of money?
Yeah, well, when you're working with bureaucracy, it's extremely hard to get new people on the block to be funded, because it's easy to be lazy and it's easy just to fund the same people that have always been funded. You have to really go out of your way to try and change a service provision. So what the ACT Party's solution is getting rid of all of the bad incentives that are in the system, taking that $2 billion a year and putting it in a centralized fund, so that we would call it the Mental Health and Addiction New Zealand Agency. So we would have one for the whole country rather than different ones based on where you're living around the country. That would have access to all of the money. And then instead of also providing the services, they would be a commissioning agency. So there'd be a range of different NGOs, different service providers throughout the country. If you have a mental health condition, you could go and book an appointment, talk to them, see what sort of care that you need, and that funding would be attached to you. And if you became unhappy with your service provision, you could take your service somewhere else. That has an incentive structure that this commissioning agency would get feedback loops of what is working and what's not. So every year you could look at statistics on how many people has this service managed to help versus another service that is obviously doing a better or worse job. And if some service is actually helping people and solving their problems, then you have the ability, you have data to know that they should actually be getting more money. And that's the problem that we have with Mike King. There's an awful lot of people who believe that his service has been helpful to them. In any other situation, you'd want that to be given more funding because it's obviously working, and for a service that's not working to be defunded.
So fundamentally, we're going to take the $2 billion away from the DHBs. They can still offer the service, but they've got to line up and show that they can do as good a job as Gumboot Friday, for example. And if they do that, then that's fine. But if someone else can do it better, they get funded. But how does this organisation, I see someone in the comments saying the criteria have to be clear. How does this organisation actually know that it's giving it to the right people?
Yeah, so this commissioning agency would fund, but it would also evaluate data through reporting systems. So you're absolutely right. If we're doing anything with taxpayer money, we need to be making sure it's accountable to where it's going and where it's being spent. At the moment, nobody has the job of asking, is this working and is the money going to where it's supposed to be going and is it being used well? We would put in place reporting mechanisms so that there's constant signals and information going back to that commissioning agency, telling them how many contracts they've signed, how many appointments they've had, and you'd be able to tell over time with evidence and data whether or not that service is actually working. So it's important that there is, in the middle, people who are helping to assess. So you wouldn't have it as anybody can just set up an organization. You'd actually have to meet some strict criteria to become a service provider that could get funded. But importantly, the commissioning agency wouldn't be there telling people you can only go to this organization for funding.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say, because I mean, nothing you're saying sounds that revolutionary. I mean, I don't mean to be critical, but the idea that you'd have one organisation that was specialised in working out who the best providers were, and then analysing the performance of people they contracted and making sure that the money went to the right people, doesn't sound that revolutionary. I think the truly shocking thing is that we spend $2 billion a year on mental health. Every government, or at least the current one, says this is the big issue, this is what we're here for. You know, the Green Party, they campaign away on it, but they don't actually have any ideas other than throwing more money into a broken system. And that's the truly amazing thing. What we're doing is just introducing how just about any business or any other organisation would operate with some contestability and some accountability. And a number of unexpected people from the political left have said that they think ACT has the best mental health policy. So it's a real innovation by Brooke and a really impressive piece of work. Our job is to get a few more votes and make sure that in a couple of years' time, you'll actually be in a position to implement it and get some people the care they need and reward some of those more nimble and innovative mental health providers, so that we end up with more mental health, or making the mental health dollar go further for the people who need it most. I want to just come back to audience questions, because we always use the second half for that. We've had a number of people writing in. There's one I'll just address now, which is actually not tonight's topic, but kind of is tonight's topic, if you know what I mean. If he had no ISIS connections and was followed by police, why wasn't he deported? Well, it's interesting. The police was the Prime Minister, was asked this question at the 5:15 stand-up that she did with journalists, and she said she really, I think the word is dissembled. It's a new word for me, but she dissembled, and she basically sort of hesitated and said it's complicated. So there's clearly another story there, and she's quite concerned about it. I don't think it really helps to speculate a whole lot. But nevertheless, I think there's now going to be a debate over what New Zealand's deportation laws are. I mean, the Australians, they play hardball. If you're not born in Australia, if you've got another citizenship, the Minister of Immigration can basically just write a letter and revoke your citizenship. I think there's a lot of problems with that. We're actually trying to get away from dictatorial powers. We're trying to protect people's rights and powers for the most part. But nevertheless, I can see there's going to be a lot of demand for that, in light of this guy who was followed around by the cops for years, apparently, at costs of millions, because under the law he couldn't be deported, couldn't be put in jail. So that's the discussion that's going to go on there. There's a few others. Steve says, would someone on a terror watch list be allowed to enter New Zealand under an ACT government? Well, funnily enough, one of the things that is in play in the counter-terrorism legislation that's currently before Parliament, before the Justice Committee, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that it would become an offence to travel to New Zealand with the intention of committing a terrorist act. So, I mean, that's a law that's been brought in under a Labour government, and ACT actually voted for it too. I think it's the right thing to do. The question of will it be legal to enter New Zealand? Well, of course, people have different rights to enter New Zealand based on their immigration status. So if you're a citizen, you can enter. You can always enter if you're a citizen, but it's a crime. If you were trying to immigrate to New Zealand and you're on a terror watch list, you wouldn't have, I'm not allowed to say that on ACT TV, but you wouldn't have much chance anyway, is what we're saying. I'll just come back to a couple of other issues. What have we got here? Actually, you've got quite a lot of questions here about mental health. Gray says, one of the major sources of mental health funding in New Zealand is ACC. Well, that's very true, Gray. Their focus is quite narrow, and oftentimes underlying issues not specifically related to an ACC claim are unable to be addressed and treated. Will ACT's new mental health funding model take this into account and seek to integrate ACC mental health provision in with the proposed new funding model? Well, Brooke, you're the spokesperson. How do we deal with those two funding sources?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. But I look at ACC funding as something that's separate to our normal mental health funding, because that is specific to people who have had a form of accident. And I think that takes a tailored type of care. But at the same time, we've seen some butchering, I guess, of the ACC system, where things that you wouldn't necessarily consider to be deemed an accident fall under ACC, things like sexual trauma, which I don't think anybody could consider to be an accident. That's a crime. So there has been ways that people have tried to progress more mental health through ACC, and I think that's just really been an admission, really, that trying to get mental health provision through the other system hasn't worked, and so it's been tried to progress through another form of system. I think there is some merit in having it all together, but I would caution completely removing ACC because that does actually have its own funding source specific for accidents.
Yeah, so it's a really good answer. It's not simple because you don't want to undermine the ACC system and merge it into something else. But clearly what needs to happen is that this service, MHANDS, the Mental Health and Addictions New Zealand that ACT would set up, needs to be able to integrate with funding from ACC that the same person may be getting for different issues. And that's certainly a policy challenge, but we believe it's one that we can overcome because the core objective should be an experience designed around the user. That's what every business in New Zealand and the world for that matter is trying to do, is serve the customer. Government, typically the bureaucratic process is first and the poor customers the afterthought, and that's true in mental health education. oranga tamariki and just about anything that government tries to do. We've just seen a comment here, Brooke for DP. I'm not sure if they want to make you the deputy principal or if they meant deputy prime minister. I'm hoping it was the latter. We'll just come back to another question here. There's what about mental health support funding for professional youth workers in schools? Currently, the schools have to enter into community funding partnerships with outside funding. So how do we approach that? Well, how would you approach that, Brooke?
Yeah, so one of the ways I think that we can actually improve mental health in schools is not necessarily actually having a guidance counsellors in every school. I think that is actually very tricky to try and roll out in practice because of the practical realities of a lack of counsellors. But one thing that I have seen, which has had huge uptake and it will only continue to grow, is younger people wanting to access help anonymously. And that's not necessarily by going to your school guidance counsellor, and that's by going online. And there's a website that I saw on the news the other day. It's called Just a Thought. And there are heaps like this, but this one's in particular quite good and already used by 32,000 New Zealanders. And it helps people with mild to moderate levels of anxiety and depression through online courses about how can you actually help yourself with anxiety? How can you help yourself with depression? And it seems to work. And it works because people who have always been afraid to reach out for help can do so anonymously and they can guide themselves through it. And I think that's kind of the system that we can see. There's a range of continuum of need. And I think we need to make sure that we're providing support in the way that people already go about their lives. And most young people already have access to a smartphone. And so that's the natural way that they'll want to reach out for help.
So that's really another example of an organisation that can come along and say that we've got a smarter, more innovative way to achieve a government objective than what the government's doing now. So meanwhile, the government's got all this money for mental health nurses and counsellors in schools, which someone's asked about in the questions. The only difficulty is that they don't have any actual people. And if you don't have a supply of skilled labour in business, then what you got to do is actually innovate and use better technology, which is what these guys have done. Under our system, would be a lot more friendly to that sort of innovation, so we get better results rather than just backing the same system, pouring money into it and wondering why nothing changes, which was something that was really almost be funny if it wasn't so serious. I saw what Andrew, what was his name, Little said the other day. He was actually said, I can't believe you could put so much money into something and it doesn't work. I mean, this guy's been a minister for 4 years. I mean, he hasn't even got used to wasting money yet. That's pretty crazy for a Labor minister, but hey, what can you do? I just one final one. We're almost running to time. Marlos says, can you look into how healthy eating helps with mental health? Would supporting the likes of Garden to Table for most schools be a good way to do this? Look, can I take this one? I love Garden to Table. If people haven't heard of it, it's where people volunteer to go into schools and help kids to grow vegetables and actually cook and enjoy eating vegetables because they find there are kids that just don't get any. If this had been around when I was at school, I'd have a much healthier diet these days. But seriously, it's a very important service. It's a wonderful example. Again, Kiwis helping Kiwis often gets a better result than taxing people and pouring money into a broken bureaucracy. So it's really impressive. I think it's something that government can help to an extent. But sometimes with those sorts of organisations, you almost don't want to ruin them by giving them government contracts that turn them into a bureaucracy as well. But a very worthwhile thing. And it's certainly true that mental health is not just getting treated, it's environmental. And by environmental, I mean, it's all the things in your life. It's your relationships, it's your nutrition, it's your work. It's not just a matter of how much treatment can you get, because at some point, someone else can't solve the problem for you. Look, we're going to have to wrap it there. Brooke, thank you very much for coming on. We're getting great comments, and obviously you've been working hard and listening to a lot of people on this topic for a long time, and we've got every hope that a couple of years actually things will change a bit in politics and you'll be in a position to implement this. So thank you, and we better say good night to everybody. Sorry that it is such a terrible day for our little country. We don't need this kind of ideologically motivated violence. What we do need is an honest conversation about what, if anything, should be different about our laws and the government's actions to avoid this happening. I don't want to prejudge that discussion because we're currently working with pretty limited information, and ACT is the party that actually opposes Russian lawmaking. It's all the other guys that do knee-jerk stuff that turns out not to work. What we do need is that honest conversation in the coming days so that we can understand what made this happen, fix it, evolve, get better, move on. That's the Kiwi way. Good night.